It's 4 p.m. on Monday, September 29th here in Korea. Welcome to ARIRANG News, live from Seoul. I'm Hyun-kyung. We begin at the National Assembly this afternoon, where leaders of the rival parties have been meeting throughout this Monday to normalize parliamentary proceedings. For the latest, ARIRANG's National Assembly correspondent Ji Myung-kil is on the line for us. So Myung-kil, fill us in, please.
Hyun-kyung, the leaders of the rival parties and representatives for the families of victims from April's ferry disaster are meeting right now behind closed doors. We presume that the trilateral meeting is focused on finding a compromise over whether the fact-finding committee will be given full investigative powers comparable to that of the state prosecutor. We're watching closely for the results of that meeting, which could set the stage for the normalization of parliamentary affairs. The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy plans to open a caucus of its party lawmakers right after the trilateral meeting ends. They'll be seeking common ground on whether to participate in tomorrow's plenary session and how to negotiate with the ruling party on the upcoming parliamentary schedule, which includes government audits and interpellation session and next year's government budget.
And Myung-kil, that meeting came about after the floor leaders of the two rival parties met this morning. Anything noteworthy from those talks?
Yes, Hyun-kyung, the ruling Plenary Party's full leader Lee Wan-gu met with his counterpart Park Young-sun of the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy this morning. Both relayed their respective stances to one another on how to deal with the special Seoul ferry bill and how to normalize parliamentary affairs. Those talks ended after both floor leaders were not able to bridge their differences, but they returned about an hour later where they agreed to the trilateral talks with a representative for the families of Seoul ferry victims.
And a plenary session is scheduled for tomorrow, and we still don't know if opposition lawmakers will be present at tomorrow's meeting. So what's the ruling party's stance on that?
Well, the ruling party is firm on the session being convened as scheduled, even without the opposition. Assembly Speaker Chung Yee-hwa adjourned the plenary session last Friday on the opposition party's request. But he'll go ahead with tomorrow's session regardless of whether opposition lawmakers are in attendance. Chung said that apart from the some 90 draft bills that need to be passed tomorrow, he also urged the review of other 30 pending bills related to the economy and improving the livelihoods of the people. The ruling plenary party has made it clear that it will not accept any more requests for delays to open the plenary session. I'll be back with more updates later on the evening as we await word from the trilateral meeting, currently taking place between the main opposition and the opposition party and the families of the Seoul ferry disaster victims. This is Ji Myung-kil reporting live from the National Assembly.
All right, many thanks, Myung-kil there. Now let's move on to the situation in Hong Kong, where people woke up to a rough start of the week as thousands of pro-democracy protesters clashed with police into the early morning hours on Monday. The situation has somewhat gotten under control, but crowds of people still remain on the streets, resolute in their demands. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
Thousands of protesters continue to occupy major streets in the heart of Hong Kong. The crowds have now somewhat thinned out, but many roads leading to the city's financial district remain blocked off as protesters ignore warnings from authorities who say the demonstrations are illegal. The Hong Kong Information Services Department says more than 36 people have been injured in clashes. Riot police have used tear gas and pepper spray on the protesters, many of whom wore goggles, ponchos, and held up umbrellas to protect themselves. Fresh protests have also broken out in the shopping district of Causeway Bay and in Mong Kok. Hong Kong's chief executive has called on citizens not to believe what he called rumors of police violence.
I hope citizens can keep their calm and not falsely believe in these rumors. The police are working hard to maintain social order, which includes the free flow of traffic. They are also protecting public safety and have exercised great restraint during their operations.
The Occupy Central movement on Sunday follows a week of student-led protests which are demanding universal suffrage in the city's first chief executive election in 2017. The demonstrators want to be allowed to directly vote for top city officials rather than Beijing-vetted candidates. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
Amid signs of warming bilateral ties, the vice foreign ministers from Korea and Japan will meet for talks later this week. Seoul's foreign ministry says its first vice minister Cho Tae-young will travel to Tokyo this Wednesday for the 13th round of strategic dialogue. Cho and his Japanese counterpart Akitaka Saiki will address a range of pending bilateral issues, including North Korea. They are also expected to discuss the details of a possible summit between their leaders, which some speculate could take place in November on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Beijing. The diplomatic tensions between South Korea, China, and Japan are complicating the resumption of the six-party nuclear disarmament talks. Now that's according to former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell. ARIRANG's Hwang Sung-hee has this exclusive interview.
In the past, the biggest problem six-party was just to get North Korea to come to the table. But now we have a whole host of very difficult bilateral issues in Asia that might complicate getting back to the table. So as a result, I think we've got to be open to other frameworks and other discussions. At the heart of that, in my view, is a recognition that the driving force behind diplomacy with North Korea increasingly has to be South Korea. I think given South Korea's increasing stature, its remarkable performance, it is only right that they take a leading role in the politics and diplomacy around the status of its own peninsula.
Do you think a new momentum can be found through a bigger role by China?
I'm one of those people that believe that the key, subtly and strategically, to unlocking some of the problems on the Korean peninsula is an improving relationship between South Korea and China. And in fact, if anything, the country that has undermined China's security, has created real problems for Beijing, is not the United States, but their dear friends, North Korea. And I think they're coming to recognize that. And the more that South Korea and China work together, the more likely it is that China will risk putting more pressure on North Korea because they know they have a country that they can work with in South Korea.
Wouldn't a strong South Korea-China ties hurt the trilateral relationship between the United States, South Korea, and Japan?
I think it's a good thing that China and South Korea are working more closely together. I am hurt and saddened by what's going on between Japan and South Korea, and I'd like very much to see steps being taken on both sides to improve the relationship. And I know how difficult it is. And I also am of the view that the United States could do more to help that process along. So I think what we want are improving constellation, web of bilateral relations. I think that will help us in Asia.
There are criticisms that Washington's strategic patience policy on North Korea has led to a bigger, more developed North Korean nuclear program. What's your take on that?
We've done everything we can to pose to North Korea that it faces a fundamental choice. It can have better relations with the West, more integration, more economic support, or it can live as exile and outcast as a nuclear state. Choose one of the two. But I think we've learned, at least from most of our experience, that North Korea does not want to relinquish its nuclear weapons. And that's fundamentally at odds with our strategic diplomacy.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It's my honor. Thank you very much.
Global sales of smartwatches, glasses, and fitness bands are expected to top $3 billion this year and eventually $10 billion by the year 2017. But could this next evolution in mobile technology knock the smartphone off its perch? Here's our Kani Kim for this week's Industry Insight.
With many believing that the smartphone market is already reaching maturity, there's a new kid on the block, wearables. Currently in its infancy stage, the market value of wearables is forecast to more than double over the next 4 years. So what can consumers expect next? Take a look. Leave your smartphone in your pocket, and with a smartwatch on your wrist alone, you can make calls, send emails, monitor your health, and stay fit. That's what the future holds for us. That's if wearables really take off. It started with Google Glass. With a voice command, the miniature computer in the upper right corner vision will take pictures, record video and audio, and search for a location. Samsung, wanting to get out in front of Apple, came out with Galaxy Gear, although pretty prematurely, many would say. And the highly anticipated Apple Watch and LG G Watch R were unveiled earlier this month. But the question is, would you wear it every day? It may be fun to show off to your friends for a day or two, but it's currently a hard sell to non-techies. And that's where the fashion industry comes in. Google's partnered up with designer Diane von Furstenberg to offer a set of stylish frames and clip-on shades. Apple is working with Burberry and high-end watchmaker Tag Heuer in a move to go stylish. But fashion is only the start. The short battery life of wearables is another factor that could turn off consumers.
In order to become part of our daily lives, the battery life needs to be extended. Battery technology is currently catered to the auto industry. Bendable, flexible, and stretchable batteries that can fit into wearables need to be developed.
The small display screens are another issue in a world where size does matter. The solution may come in the form of holograms or virtual displays controlled by voice command.
Interface will increasingly be voice as opposed to text, largely because you can speak to a wearable device and not be limited by the size of the keyboard. So that really is the future, I think.
From smartphones to now smartwatches and glasses, the technology is poised to be all around us in the near future, whether through smart homes, smart cars, or even smart shoes. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Korea posted a current account surplus for the 30th straight month in August, but the margin was down from the previous month. The Bank of Korea says last month's surplus stood at nearly $7.3 billion, which is down nearly $600 million from the July figure. Analysts attribute the on-month drop to seasonal factors, such as the nation's tourism deficit expanding as many Koreans opted to travel overseas for summer vacations. Including August, Korea's current account surplus during the year has totaled more than $54 billion. The central bank forecasts the cumulative surplus for the entire year to be around $84 billion. Now, traditionally, Japanese tourists used to spend a lot more abroad compared to Korean travelers, but as our Kim Ji-yeon reports, times are changing with a number of variables at play.
The amount of money spent by Koreans while traveling overseas is expected to surpass that of Japanese tourists for the first time this year. Koreans spent an all-time high of $21.7 billion overseas last year, after recording a steady increase since 2009. The amount spent by the Japanese tourists last year was just $100 million higher. Traditionally, expenditures from Japanese tourists have been higher than their Korean counterparts, which is understandable given that Japan's gross domestic product is 4 times higher than Korea's, and that its population is more than 2 times greater. So why the change in dynamics? The Korea Culture and Tourism Institute attributes it to the falling value of the Japanese yen against the Korean won. It's now more expensive for the Japanese to spend capital in Korea, while relatively cheaper for Koreans to buy goods and services in Japan. The current exchange rate hovers around 950 won to 100 yen, the lowest it's been since 2008. In the long run, the strengthening of the Korean currency could adversely affect Korean exporters since they're losing price competitiveness in global trade. However, an analyst from Investment and Securities says it's too premature to be overly concerned by the valuation of the Korean currency since the trend is not expected to continue over the long term.
The Bank of Korea is expected to lower the country's main benchmark rate in the coming months. This, coupled with Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan's expansionary policies, will help to lower the value of the Korean currency by the end of this year.
The Bank of Korea lowered its interest rate by 25 basis points in August, ending a 15-month freeze. Kim Jeon, ARIRANG News.
The heads of Korea's biggest banking groups are reportedly taking home much larger paychecks than their counterparts in many other advanced nations, including Japan and the U.S. And there are increasing calls to put an end to this. Our Son Jung-in has more.
Ousted Chief of KB Financial Ji Myung-kil, who was dismissed after being suspended over a series of mismanagement charges, received nearly $600,000 in salary during the first half of this year. Im's salary may seem high for some, but it pales in comparison to the heads of other local banking groups. According to data from January to June period this year, Citibank Korea CEO Hyun-kyung was paid $2.3 million, while Hana Financial Group Chairman Kim Jung-tae received more than $1.2 million. The figure was similar last year, with top banking groups' chief executives taking home bumper bonuses and stock shares on top of their basic salary. Market watchers claim their paychecks are too high. The average pay for financial CEOs in Japan is around $1 million, roughly a third of what their Korean counterparts receive. But Japan's banks' combined net profits are nearly 10 times higher than those in Korea. Korean banks are also known to pay their CEOs more than those in the U.S., even higher than Bank of America, which is the fourth biggest bank in the world. Data shows that banks in Japan and the U.S. earn half of their profits doing business overseas. The same figure is under 10% for banks in Korea. Local banks have come under criticism for lining their pockets, while society's most vulnerable struggle to pay off high-interest loans. Son Jung-in, ARIRANG News.
While more women are entering the workforce here in Korea, the glass ceiling remains very much intact. A new report from Credit Suisse shows that the proportion of female executives in Korea is slightly over 1%, the lowest among the 36 nations surveyed, and far behind Thailand, which topped the list at more than 26%. The report also points to Korea's gender pay gap, which is at 39%, the highest on the list. Now, these are some of the issues the government has been trying to address in recent years, but experts say a lot more support needs to be provided to women in Korea after they give birth if the country wants to see many of them return to the workforce. Now, in Korean society, there has always been a thin line between discipline and abuse when it comes to physical punishment. But whether thin or thick, that line will now come with a hefty sentence. Our Kwon So-ah has this next report.
The Korean public was outraged earlier this year over a series of cases in which women physically abused their stepdaughters to death. Despite the severity of their actions, the two offenders were punished with 10 and 15 years in prison, respectively. The cases and others like them prompted the country to strengthen the laws against child abuse. Before the law was revised, people found guilty of abusive actions that resulted in the death of a child received a minimum of 3 years in prison with a possibility of suspended sentence. Under the new law, a convicted offender will get a minimum 5-year sentence and could face life in prison. A parent who physically harms their child could also have their parental rights deprived, and the punishments for childcare workers who are found guilty of violent acts will be strengthened. Adults who suspect abuse will now be required by law to report their suspicions to police or relevant agencies. Those in positions of power, such as teachers and childcare workers, will face fines of up to 5 million won, or roughly $4,800 for failing to do so. Child welfare experts welcome the changes, but say cooperation with related organizations will be necessary for them to be effective. They also point out that there is a lack of manpower at child protection centers in the nation. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
It's time to check out the latest on the Incheon Asian Games. The highlight of the weekend for most Koreans was Sunday's baseball final between Korea and Chinese Taipei. For more, Arirang's Song Ji-sun joins us from the news center. So Ji-sun, Team Korea won, but apparently it wasn't an easy win.
Absolutely, it was a roller coaster ride for the players and the thousands of fans who gathered into the stadium to cheer them on for the gold. Chinese Taipei had a 3-2 lead going into the 8th inning, and after Park Byung-ho walked out, Kang Jung-ho's hit by pitch tied the game. Following Na Sung-bung's ground to second base gave Korea the 4-3 lead, and Hwang Jae-gyun then hit a 2-run single to right to seal the victory. Korea kept it that way until the last inning, 6-3, winning their second straight Asian Games gold and 4th in total.
So that must have been a game to watch. And believe it or not, we have only 5 days remaining now in the Asian Games. And what events should we look forward to from here on?
Well, actually, 2 players from the badminton superpower China will fight it out for the gold in the men's singles. That is 2-time Olympic singles champion Lin Dan, who will play against teammate Chun Lung, who won the bronze in the London Olympics 2 years ago. And in women's football, the semis will be the most crucial match in deciding who will take the gold at this year's Asian Games 2014. The 2 hottest favorites for the gold, which are South Korea and North Korea, they will play each other tonight in the semifinal. That game kicks off at 8 p.m. in Korea time at Munhak Stadium. This actually will be the last match that Korea's first ever female English Premier Leaguer, Chelsea ladies Ji So-yeon, can play for the Korean squad as she has commitments at the famous London club.
All right, thank you very much, Ji-sun, for the updates, and we will keep an eye on that match for that matter too. Thank you, Ji-sun, once again.
Good afternoon, I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather forecast. We've been having on and off showers all across the nation since yesterday, but they should clear by this evening starting in the central region. Now, except for Jeju Island, which will continue be seeing rain throughout tomorrow with a total accumulation of 30 millimeters. Now, Seoul is expecting less than 5 millimeters over the upcoming hours, while most other regions will see around 10. Now, rain has brought down our daytime temperatures. Highs are ranging in the low to high 20s, depending where you are. Now, as for the weather conditions in Incheon, where the Asian Games are being held, the rain has stopped, but the clouds will stick around with the highs reaching up to 21 degrees. Now, going over to our today's readings, Seoul will peak at 22 this afternoon. All the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will reach up to 24 and 26 degrees. And moving over to other regions, Jeju Island will get up to 28, while Dokdo and Mangungang are slightly lower at 22. Well, that's all for Korea. Now here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that does it for this edition of our newscast. Thank you for watching. I'll be back with more updates at 6 p.m. Korea time.